May and June are the graduation months. And across the country, at institutions of higher learning and high schools, the names of young people are read because they've accomplished some significant milestones in their lives, graduation from their high schools or their universities or their graduate schools. People who've been able, these names are people, of course, who've been able to leverage their skills and their resources for their own good, and ultimately, I think, for the good of all of us, because an educated citizenry is good for all of us. No doubt that when those names are read, the families are present, and there's celebrations, and perhaps restaurants are full in those towns, and people are joyful about the names that they've heard. So here's a list of names you'll never hear among the ranks of America's graduates. And when we hear their names, it's usually because now they've become associated with pain and anguish and anger. Freddie Gray, Baltimore. Eric Garner, Brooklyn. Michael Brown, Ferguson. And Oscar Grant in Oakland. Each of them died at the hands of police who were faced with an impossible task, the task of maintaining order in a minefield of America's broken cities. Each of these men grew up in poverty that's unimaginable for most of us. Each of them, in some ways, embodies the dysfunctional lives that a poor education and broken families and exposure to violence create. And for each of these names I read, their deaths sparked some kind of a conflagration in their home cities. Conflagrations that engulfed homes and businesses. And there was no celebration of their accomplishments. And the truth is, they likely had few to celebrate. And what of the other participants in those riots? Well, those other participants also were ravaged by the ills of poverty. Few dream of graduation from high school, and college for most of the folks in these towns is just inconceivable. In fact, life is so difficult in the poorest reaches of American society that many of the children show symptoms of PTSD. Yes, it's the same PTSD that Iraq war veterans come home with, because these children are confronted by violence and trauma almost every day of their lives. So how can we be surprised when things explode? How can we be surprised when the keepers of the peace, the police force, become paradoxically, and not because of anything they've necessarily done, but become kindling that's thrown on the fire of the simmering neighborhoods, where poverty and ills are so endemic that it doesn't take much for things to erupt into flames. This is the American cycle, it seems, since the first race riots in the 1960s. It's become as much a part of the great American traditions as the World Series and fireworks on July 4th. Except for these traditions are painful. And the riots erupt periodically, and they're never convenient. In the 1960s, it was LA, and it was Chicago, and New York, and dozens of other cities that exploded. And Martin Luther King marched, and Lyndon Johnson horse-traded, and sweeping civil rights laws were passed, and the greatest changes in America's society since the Civil War were put into effect. And it was hoped that the laws would fix the problems of the decade, but the problems of poverty and race persisted. And then in the 1970s, Detroit and San Francisco and Albuquerque and Washington, D.C., just to name a few, also erupted. And the cities responded with busing and forced integration of school systems, and it was hoped that these steps would fix the problems of that era. But the problems of poverty and race persisted. And along came the 1980s. Poverty didn't disappear, but things were quieter. Only a few cities burned. And during that era, Ronald Reagan cut millions of dollars to housing subsidies for the poor, such as Section 8, and under the notion that free market forces would result in more housing for America's poor. And he presided over tremendous cutbacks in so-called entitlement programs under the theory that they created a culture of dependency, and to remove that dependency would allow people to rise up on their own. And it was hoped that these problems would fix the issues of that era. But the problems of poverty and race persisted. And then in the 1990s, LA exploded. And once again, smoke rose to the heavens. And so LA created a police commission to transform a police department that was relatively adversarial and homogeneously white, run by Daryl Gates, into a multicultural institution with innovative community policing and a much more judicious use of force. And nationally, welfare-to-work programs were instituted by President Bill Clinton. And these changes were supposed to fix the problems of that era. But poverty and race persisted. So here we are in the 2000s. And once again, our cities are burning. There have been riots in Oakland and Anaheim and Brooklyn and Ferguson and Berkeley and New York and in Baltimore. And the fuel of poverty and disenfranchisement and alienation and hopelessness continues. And it only takes a tiny spark to light a conflagration of destruction and despair. Now, the critics and the cynics say that this cycle of poverty proves that nothing works. They say what's needed are more moms like Toya Graham. She's now the television personality who screamed profanities at her son when he attempted to participate in one of those riots in Baltimore. And she's been paraded on TV and radio like some new parental role model. But they leave out the details of Toya's life. She's the unemployed mother of 6 different fathers. She lives in Section 8 housing. She can feed her family because of the SNAP program that provides vouchers for food. And she lives and is able to clothe her family because of welfare and unemployment insurance. And it's probably likely that her kids are afflicted by PTSD because that's what's endemic to the kids who live in those neighborhoods. So while strong parents are certainly critical for the healthy growth and development of our children, there's no doubt that that's what's needed. That alone will not lift Americans out of poverty. It just seems that no matter what we do, the problems of race and poverty persist. So it's tempting to throw up our hands or succumb to the temptations of those simple solutions that are thrown at us from the sound bites of politicians and media. But I want to share some Torah wisdom with you. And I included it in the Shabbat bulletin. It's an insert. I'm going to skim it, but I really want you to take it home. I want you to take it home because there are many incredible passages in the Torah that speak ancient truths that are as relevant today as they were in antiquity. This one is among the most powerful. So the first line says, "There shall be no needy among you, since the Lord your God will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a hereditary portion." Imagine that, no needy among us. What is this? This is a vision. This is hope. This is the beginning of the section that starts with promise of abundance and providence. This is the world that we dream of. It's not the world that is. So verse 7 comes along, the next paragraph. And it says, "If, however, there is a needy person among you, one of your kinsmen in any of your settlements, in the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinsman. Rather, you must open your hand and lend him sufficient for whatever he needs, This is the response, and I would argue that this is the only response to poverty. Not anger, not resentment, not the iron fist of prison or tear gas or riot gear. Open our hands. Lift them up. Give them hope. And the text says, give them what they need. And then it ends with the harsh truth. Verse 11. For there will never cease to be needy ones in your land. 3 passages. A passage of abundance, a passage of response, and a passage of truth. There will always be poverty. Written 2,500 years ago, and it still rings true today. Despite the bounty that some of us enjoy, others will be in poverty, because that's the world. That's humanity. But despite that, and these 3 passages come together, we must never close our hands. So the ancient truth is our truth as well, I think. And we've opened our hands in this country now in a meaningful way for 6 decades. And then while there are those who claim anecdotally that it hasn't done any good, the folks who do the research tell us that our poverty rates have fallen by 40% since 1967. Is it the progress we'd like? No. But is it progress? Yeah. And most of those researchers credit the progression of these profoundly imperfect poverty programs that we've been experimenting with for the past 50 years. And here's what's particularly incredible about those experiments. At their core is some 12th century Jewish wisdom, the wisdom of Moses Maimonides, who conceived of a ladder of tzedakah, a ladder of giving, a ladder that would bring dignity to the extent that it's humanly possible to the poor that live in every community. And at the bottom of that ladder, Maimonides put give money directly into their hands. It's the lowest rung of the ladder, but it's still on the ladder. And the highest rung is give those who are economically disadvantaged the means to lift themselves out of poverty. But until they're able to utilize their resources, we have to provide them with the sustenance they need to thrive and survive. It's frustrating. It's maddening. It's daunting. But what we can't do is stick our heads in the sand and pretend like the problem isn't ours. My colleague Sharon Brous provides a parable. She taught me this parable when she was speaking to about 800 people of all different colors gathered at Holman Methodist Church in Watts to speak about poverty. She said there are 20 passengers on a boat, and one of the passengers opens up his bag and takes out a drill, sticks it into the bottom of the boat, and starts drilling. And as he's drilling and the noise reverberates through the boat, the passengers look at him, "What are you doing? You're putting a hole in the boat." He says, "Don't worry, it's only under my seat." Here's what that parable teaches. The hole may be under someone else's seat, but our boat is sinking. Our boat is sinking. And here's what it means to be part of a synagogue, and here's what it means to be part of this synagogue. Because at Stephen Wise, we've written into our vision statement, our mission for our congregation, is that we're committed to change the world for the better, that we're committed to tikkun olam. We're committed to reaching out beyond the walls of the sanctuary to making a difference in the world. Because we can't accept that the hole in the boat is someone else's problem. Because we have to invest, we know that we have to invest our time and our resources and our votes and our hopes in programs that each of us believe will help lift the low tide of poverty. And we have to believe that no matter how daunting, every small action matters. That's why we have a freedom school. We have a freedom school because 225 children come to 3 campuses that we run, and become proficient readers and go back to school more determined to learn because they've been inspired by our positive role models and they've been loved by our high school students, Jewish high school students, that volunteer with kids from Latino schools and trade hugs and text messages and written letters of affection because the experience has been so inspirational. And you can volunteer or you can contribute. And that's why more than a dozen kids are being mentored towards college by Temple volunteers through the Fulfillment Fund. Because we believe that we have something to give them, that our inspiration can help the dream of college that Fulfillment Fund helps realize become a reality for them with our mentorship. And you can be a mentor, or you can volunteer periodically. And that's why more than 45 homeless vets were permanently placed in apartments owned by our congregants or their colleagues. Because we believe that working with the United Way and its program called Home for Good will help alleviate the homelessness for 10,000 vets that are homeless in Los Angeles. That is an unconscionable number. And we need more units. Who do you know? Do you own property? Can you make an apartment available to one of our country's veterans? And that's why we'll continue to work with LA Voice, our interfaith partner, to make sure that our property taxes go to programs that keep kids out of jail and in school. Because we need your voices to speak up and let our leaders know that Jews on the West Side care about kids in Boyle Heights and South Central. And we want to let those kids know that we care. And that's why we as Reformed Jews support the Religious Action Center. It's the only lobbying organization sponsored by a religious denomination that lobbies for social causes that are not of direct interest to the folks who support the lobbying organization. We refuse to accept the world as it is. We refuse to let the boat sink out from under us. We refuse to let the fuels that burn in the fires of poverty continue to grow. But most of all, we can't ignore the deep canyons of despair that continue to divide our cities, to cut them in two. We are convinced that it is not someone else's problem. It is America's problem. And I know that you join me every day in thanking God that we live in a country that has the means and the ingenuity to never, ever give up the fight to end poverty in our land. Amen.